He had survived Twilight Mania. He had walked red carpets in Cannes. He had stared down the most grueling film critics in the world and come out the other side with his reputation not just intact but polished to a shine. In 20-plus years of Hollywood, Jake Gyllenhaal had faced almost everything the industry could throw at a human being, and he had handled it. Every time. With intelligence. With composure. With the particular brand of quiet confidence that separates the ones who last from the ones who flame out. But nobody told him about that Tuesday morning. Nobody told him that the moment he settled into that chair on The View, adjusted his posture, flashed the smile that had been disarming interviewers for 2 decades, and prepared to do what he had done 100 times before. Nobody told him that this time, one of the sharpest women in the history of daytime television was about to ask him the one question his entire playbook had no answer for. And when she did, in front of a live studio audience, with every camera rolling and nowhere on earth to hide, Jake Gyllenhaal did something almost nobody expected. He pushed back. If you have ever watched a man realize mid-sentence that the ground beneath a conversation has shifted and there is nothing he can do but keep talking, you know exactly the kind of moment we are about to walk you through. And if you have not, you are about to. Welcome to Prime Talk. This is where live television stops pretending and starts telling the truth. Subscribe to Prime Talk right now, hit that like button, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because today we are breaking down one of the most gripping, unscripted, and genuinely revealing moments The View has ever accidentally produced. Share this with someone who thinks they already know this story. They do not know the full version. Not yet. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Jake Gyllenhaal did not become one of Hollywood's most respected actors by accident. He became one because he made choices that most actors at his level were too cautious to make. Early in his career, when the industry was offering him the safer path, the franchise roles, the blockbuster sequels, the kind of work that builds bank accounts faster than legacies, he went a different direction. He chose Donnie Darko when nobody could tell him with confidence it would find an audience. He chose Brokeback Mountain when the role carried genuine professional risk in a Hollywood that was not yet fully ready for the conversation that film was going to start. He chose Zodiac and Prisoners and Nightcrawler, dark, demanding, psychologically complex films that required him to go to places that comfortable actors simply do not go. The result was a filmography that critics reference when they are making arguments about what serious American acting looks like in the modern era. Not the loudest filmography, not the most commercially dominant, but one of the most consistently respected. And in an industry where respect is both the hardest currency to earn and the easiest to lose, Jake Gyllenhaal had accumulated more of it than almost anyone in his peer group. That is who walked into The View on that Tuesday morning. Not a fading star looking for a comeback moment. Not a celebrity in crisis, desperate for sympathetic airtime. A man at a stable and respectable point in his career, there to do what actors do during a promotional cycle. Show up, be charming, answer the expected questions, and leave. He had done it dozens of times. The format holds no mysteries for someone with his experience. You arrive. You greet the hosts with the warmth that the setting requires. You answer questions about the project. You deflect the more personal questions with enough grace that the audience feels like they got something real without you having actually given anything away. You leave. You move to the next stop on the press tour. That is the playbook. It is not cynical. It is simply the reality of how promotional media functions, and the celebrities who understand it are the ones who survive long careers with their public image largely intact. Jake Gyllenhaal understood it completely, which is precisely why what happened that morning was so arresting to everyone who witnessed it. Because the playbook failed. Not because he forgot it. Not because Joy Behar somehow found a way to trick him into abandoning it. But because the question she asked was the kind of question that the playbook was never designed to handle. The kind that arrives wrapped in casual language but carries real weight underneath. The kind that lands in a spot where deflection would be more damaging than engagement. And so he engaged. Now, Joy Behar. If you are going to understand why this particular host on this particular show was able to create this particular moment, you need to understand who she is beyond the clip that brought you here. Joy Behar has been a fixture of American daytime television for longer than most of the people watching this video have been adults. She is a comedian by training, a commentator by instinct, and a broadcaster by decades of accumulated experience that simply cannot be replicated by preparation alone. She has sat across from presidents, politicians, activists, and celebrities. She has navigated live television controversies that would have ended careers less anchored than hers. And through all of it, she has maintained the one quality that makes her genuinely dangerous as an interviewer. She does not care enough about a guest's comfort to sacrifice her own curiosity. That is not cruelty. It is a professional commitment to honesty that is rarer in daytime television than it should be. The View itself is a specific kind of institution. It was built on the premise that a group of women with different perspectives, different backgrounds, and different levels of willingness to say the uncomfortable thing could generate conversations that a more controlled format never would. At its best, that premise produces moments of genuine television, moments where something real surfaces through the professional polish that every guest brings to the table. At its absolute best, it produces moments like the one we are about to walk you through. But here is what you need to keep in mind as we move forward. The moment itself, the exchange, the snapback, the silence that followed, did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived at the end of a long runway of context. Context that Jake Gyllenhaal was aware of. Context that Joy Behar was aware of. And context that the audience in that studio was only partially aware of, which is part of what made the moment land so differently for the people in that room versus the millions who encountered it later online. Understanding that context is the difference between watching a clip and understanding a story. And the story, as it always is with these things, is far more interesting than the clip. What was Jake Gyllenhaal carrying into that studio that morning? What had the months preceding that interview looked like, publicly, professionally, and in the quieter spaces where celebrity narratives form before they ever reach a talk show table? And what was it, specifically, that Joy Behar decided she was not going to let pass without comment? That is where we are going next. And when you have the full picture, when you understand everything that was already in motion before either of them said a single word to each other, the moment itself is going to hit you completely differently than it did the first time you saw it. To understand what happened inside that studio, you first have to understand what was happening outside of it. Because the conversation that Joy Behar brought to that table on that Tuesday morning did not originate in a production meeting. It did not come from a list of approved talking points submitted by a segment producer the night before. It came from somewhere much harder to control, from the court of public opinion, which had been quietly assembling a case around Jake Gyllenhaal for months before anyone on live television had the nerve to raise it directly. And that is where this story really begins. Not on a talk show set, but in the slow, patient accumulation of moments, observations, and public narratives that had been building around one of Hollywood's most carefully managed public images. Jake Gyllenhaal had spent a significant stretch of time in a promotional cycle tied to his work on the Amazon Prime Video remake of Roadhouse. The project represented a deliberate pivot, a commercially oriented action film from an actor whose brand had been built almost entirely on prestige drama. By most critical measures, it worked. The film performed. Gyllenhaal received positive notices for his physical commitment to the role. The promotional machinery was running smoothly. Interview after interview, he was landing well. Charming. Articulate. On the surface, the press tour looked like a success. But surfaces are deceptive. Underneath the smooth operation of that promotional cycle, something else was running simultaneously. A conversation that had nothing to do with the film and everything to do with the man promoting it. It had started, as so many things do in the modern era, on social media. Old interviews. Old quotes. Old observations from people who had worked with Gyllenhaal or existed in his professional orbit, circulating again in a media environment that has become extraordinarily skilled at retrieving the past and recontextualizing it against the present. The most prominent thread in this conversation centered on his past relationship with Taylor Swift. This is not a minor detail. Taylor Swift, by the time this story was unfolding, was not simply a pop star. She was a cultural phenomenon of a scale that has few modern equivalents. Her fan base, fiercely loyal, extraordinarily organized, and deeply attuned to the narratives surrounding people in her past, had spent years examining the relationship she had with Gyllenhaal in 2010 and 2011, and the way it had ended. The examination had intensified significantly when Swift released the extended version of All Too Well. The song, long understood by fans to reference Gyllenhaal, returned with additional verses that painted a portrait of the relationship with emotional specificity that made detachment difficult for listeners. Many interpreted the dynamic it described as one marked by emotional negligence and a meaningful power imbalance. She had been 19 at the time. He had been 29. The public response was substantial. Think pieces were written. His social media presence was flooded with commentary ranging from pointed criticism to something considerably less measured. He largely did not respond publicly at the time, which meant the narrative around him calcified without any counter voice from him shaping it. By the time he arrived on the Roadhouse press tour, That conversation had not dissipated. It had simply gone from a boil to a simmer, the kind of persistent low heat that follows a public figure from one interview to the next without ever quite being addressed head-on. Interviewers had danced around it. Most had ultimately pulled back from asking directly, either out of professional courtesy or genuine uncertainty about how to raise it without it consuming the entire interview. Jake Gyllenhaal had navigated all of it with the composure of someone who had made a deliberate decision about how to handle the subject and was executing that decision consistently. His responses were measured. He maintained the position, implied rather than stated, that some things are private and that the interpretation of art is subjective. It was a defensible position, professionally executed. But defensible is not the same as settled. And the conversation had not gone away. Then came a separate but related layer of public discussion. Reports and commentary had circulated regarding his behavior in certain professional settings, nothing formally documented, nothing constituting a claim of misconduct in any legal sense, but the kind of anecdotal observations that, in the current cultural climate, carry real weight in shaping public perception. Descriptions of a working style that some collaborators had found difficult. A personal manner that some people in his orbit had experienced as dismissive. None of this had been directly challenged in any major interview setting. The promotional machine around Roadhouse had kept him largely in environments where these subjects were unlikely to surface, entertainment outlets focused on the film, physical training profiles, coverage that kept the lens on the project rather than the person. The View was a different environment entirely. Joy Behar, in the weeks leading up to Gyllenhaal's appearance, had been in her most characteristically direct mode. She had made headlines with pointed commentary on several public figures. She had demonstrated, repeatedly, that the editorial restraint governing many daytime interview segments was not something she felt bound by when she believed a more honest conversation was available. She was also, by every observable measure, paying close attention to the cultural conversation surrounding Taylor Swift, a conversation that was embedded in American media so thoroughly during that period that no engaged television personality could have missed its surrounding narratives, including the ones touching on Jake Gyllenhaal. So when his appearance on The View was confirmed and scheduled, the conditions for what was about to happen were already in place. Not engineered, not conspired, simply present, the way weather conditions exist before a storm. Each element individually unremarkable, collectively pointing toward something significant. He walked in prepared for a promotional interview. Joy Behar walked in with something else entirely on her mind. And somewhere between the opening pleasantries and the moment the conversation found its sharpest edge, the outcome was already in motion. The question was coming, and Jake Gyllenhaal had no idea yet how much it was going to cost him to answer it. The first few minutes of the segment had been exactly what everyone in that studio expected them to be. Warm, professional. The kind of daytime television exchange that moves at a comfortable rhythm. A question about the film, an answer about the training process, a moment of audience laughter, another question, another answer. Jake Gyllenhaal was doing what he always does in these settings. He was present. He was engaged. He was giving the interview everything it needed to function without giving it anything it wasn't supposed to have. The co-hosts rotated through their questions in the way The View's format naturally produces. Each woman taking a thread of the conversation, pulling it briefly, then passing it along. The energy in the studio was settled. The audience was responsive but not electric. It was morning television operating at its expected temperature. And then Joy Behar spoke. She had been listening. That is the thing about her that gets underestimated by guests who have not sat across from her before. She does not perform engagement while privately composing her next question. She actually follows the conversation as it develops, which means her pivots are responsive rather than mechanical. They come from what she has just heard, not from a note card on the desk in front of her. She acknowledged something Gyllenhaal had just said, a comment about the personal nature of creative work, about how much of yourself you pour into a role, about the relationship between an actor and the material they choose. It was the kind of reflective answer that plays well in interview settings. Thoughtful, slightly philosophical. The kind of thing that usually prompts a follow-up about the next project or a compliment from the host about his body of work. Joy Behar did not compliment him. Instead, with a tone that had not visibly shifted, still conversational, still carrying the warmth that her delivery almost always maintains regardless of what the words beneath it are doing, she turned the conversation. She asked him about Taylor Swift. Not obliquely. Not wrapped in 3 layers of diplomatic framing designed to give him a comfortable exit before the question even finished forming. She asked it with the directness that is her signature, The kind of question that sounds almost simple when it leaves someone's mouth, until the person it was directed at fully processes what has just been asked of them and realizes that simple and easy are not the same thing. The specific framing of her question touched on the public narrative that had surrounded him for years. The age gap, the relationship, the way it had ended, and the very public artistic response that had followed it. She did not recite allegations. She did not read from a list of fan complaints. She asked him, in plain language, what he wanted people to understand about who he was in that situation. Because the public, she noted, had formed a fairly firm impression, and that impression had not been kind. 4 seconds passed. They were not comfortable seconds. The kind of silence that falls over a live television studio when something unexpected has just occurred is a specific kind of silence, not empty, but loaded. The audience felt it before they fully understood it. The other co-hosts felt it too. There was a slight, involuntary stillness at the table, the kind of physical response that happens when people in a shared space sense that the ground has shifted and they are waiting to see which direction things fall. Jake Gyllenhaal's expression did not collapse. That is important to note, because what happened next was not a breakdown. It was not a moment of visible distress or emotional unraveling. What crossed his face in those 4 seconds was something more controlled than that, and somehow more revealing because of it. It was the expression of a man making a rapid internal calculation, of someone who had prepared for many versions of this interview and was now confronting a version that none of his preparation had fully accounted for. He leaned forward slightly. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it, and it registered as a shift in posture that communicated, without a single word, that the register of the conversation had just changed. And then he responded. He did not deflect. That is the first and most significant thing about what came out of his mouth. He did not reach for the standard tools, the gentle redirect, the pivot to a broader observation about art and interpretation, the self-deprecating comment designed to release tension without engaging substance. Those tools were available to him. He chose not to use them. What he said instead was pointed, measured, delivered with a control that made it clear every word was intentional. He pushed back on the framing of the question, not aggressively, but with a precision that had an edge to it. He challenged the premise that public narrative constituted public truth. He made the argument, carefully and without raising his voice, that a song is one person's perspective on a shared experience, and that perspective, however powerfully expressed and however widely embraced, does not represent the complete picture of what occurred between two private individuals. He did not attack Taylor Swift. He did not dismiss the emotional reality of her artistry. But he drew a line, clearly, firmly, and on live television, between the story that had been told publicly and the fuller truth that he believed existed beyond it. Joy Behar listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not soften. When he finished, she held the moment for just a beat longer than was comfortable. The pause of someone who has heard an answer and is deciding, in real time, whether it actually addressed the question. The audience, which had gone very quiet, was still processing what they had just witnessed. The other co-hosts exchanged the briefest of glances. And somewhere in the control room, a producer was already aware that this particular segment had just become something other than a promotional interview. The moment had happened. Unedited. Unplanned. Exactly the kind of thing that live television produces when the format breaks down and something genuine takes its place. What came next, in the studio, online, and in the broader cultural conversation, was about to move fast. The studio did not explode. That is the first thing worth saying about what happened in the immediate seconds after Jake Gyllenhaal finished speaking. There was no dramatic audience reaction. No gasp that rippled through the rows of seated viewers. No co-host jumping in with a comment designed to diffuse or redirect. What happened instead was something quieter than that, and in many ways more powerful because of its quiet. The room absorbed it. That is the only accurate way to describe those first few seconds of aftermath. The audience, the co-hosts, the floor crew, everyone in that studio took a collective, almost unconscious breath and processed what they had just witnessed. Because what had just happened was not the kind of television moment that announces itself loudly. It was the kind that arrives softly and then expands, the way a stone dropped in still water sends rings outward in every direction long after the initial impact. Joy Behar broke the silence. Not immediately. She let it sit for just long enough that its weight was fully felt by everyone in the room. And then she responded, not with an apology for having asked the question, and not with a retreat into safer conversational territory. She acknowledged what he had said. She engaged with it directly. In a brief but pointed exchange that followed his pushback, she made clear that she understood his position while also making equally clear that she did not consider the matter entirely resolved by the explanation he had offered. It was, in its own way, as impressive as the question itself. Because the easiest thing for a host to do after a guest pushes back on a difficult question is to soften, to smile and pivot, to give the guest the out they are implicitly asking for and move the conversation some way less charged. Joy Behar did not do that. She held her position without escalating. She maintained the pressure without increasing it. It was the work of someone who has been doing live television long enough to know that the most powerful thing you can do in a moment of tension is simply refuse to pretend the tension isn't there. Jake Gyllenhaal, for his part, maintained his composure through the remainder of the segment. He did not shut down. He did not become visibly hostile. But something had shifted in his energy, something subtle enough that a casual viewer might have missed it but unmistakable to anyone watching with full attention. The ease that had characterized the opening minutes of the interview did not fully return. His answers in the final portion of the segment were slightly shorter, slightly more contained. The conversational fluidity that had been present before Joy Behar's question did not come back at the same level. He left the set professionally, thanked the hosts, moved through the post-interview formalities with the practiced grace of someone who has done this many times. But the tape existed. The broadcast had gone out live. And within the hour, the clip was moving. The online response was immediate and substantial. Within the first few hours of the segment airing, the exchange between Gyllenhaal and Behar had been clipped, captioned, and distributed across every major social media platform. The reactions divided almost instantly along the lines that these conversations always divide. Those who felt Joy Behar had crossed a line by bringing a deeply personal subject into a promotional interview setting, and those who felt she had done precisely what a journalist of her experience and platform should do when given direct access to someone at the center of a long-running public conversation. Taylor Swift's fanbase, which had maintained a sustained interest in the narratives surrounding Gyllenhaal for years, responded with the organized intensity that has become one of the defining characteristics of that community's public engagement. The clip circulated widely within those spaces, accompanied by commentary that ranged from measured analysis to something considerably more pointed. His name trended again, not for the first time, and likely not for the last. Entertainment media picked up the story within hours. Publications that cover celebrity culture from every angle, from the straightforwardly fan-oriented to the more analytically inclined, ran pieces on the exchange. The framing varied depending on the outlet, but the core of every piece was the same. Something real had happened on a daytime talk show, and it had happened in a way that could not be edited, softened, or strategically reframed after the fact because it had aired live and the tape was already everywhere. For Jake Gyllenhaal, the immediate aftermath represented a specific kind of challenge that most public relations strategies are not fully equipped to handle. The promotional cycle for Roadhouse, which had been running smoothly and generating the kind of coverage the project needed, now had a competing narrative running alongside it. Every interview he gave in the days following the View appearance was colored by what had happened on that set. Journalists who might not have raised the Taylor Swift subject directly were now operating in a media environment where the subject had been raised, on live television, by Joy Behar, and with his response on the record. He did not make a formal public statement about the exchange. His team did not issue a clarification or attempt to reframe his words through a prepared comment. The strategic decision, visible in retrospect, appeared to be to let the moment pass without feeding it additional oxygen. It was, arguably, the correct instinct. Public statements issued in the wake of viral interview moments rarely improve the situation for the person at the center of them. They tend instead to extend the news cycle and give media outlets a fresh angle to pursue. But the moment did not simply pass. That is the thing about exchanges that reach a certain threshold of cultural resonance. They do not dissolve the way ordinary news items do. They become reference points. They get cited in subsequent conversations about the people involved. They enter the ongoing public record in a way that future interviewers, future journalists, and future audiences carry with them into every subsequent encounter with the subject. What Joy Behar did that morning was not, in the final analysis, an act of ambush journalism. It was not a cheap attempt to generate controversy at a guest's expense. It was something more substantive than that, a decision by an experienced broadcaster to treat a public figure as fully accountable to the public conversation that surrounds him, rather than offering the protective distance that promotional media typically provides. Whether Jake Gyllenhaal deserved that accountability in the precise form it arrived, and whether the View's morning format was the appropriate venue for it, are questions that reasonable people have continued to debate. What is not debatable is that the moment happened, that it was real, that it was unscripted and unedited and witnessed by millions in real time, and that both people in that exchange revealed something true about themselves. Joy Behar's refusal to perform comfort she does not feel, and Jake Gyllenhaal's refusal to simply absorb a difficult question without response. In a media landscape saturated with content that is managed, curated, and strategically released to create a specific impression, that kind of unmediated moment is increasingly rare. Which is why, long after the Roadhouse press tour concluded and the news cycle moved on to other subjects, the clip of that Tuesday morning on The View continued to surface, continued to be shared, continued to generate the same debates it generated the first time. Because some moments in live television are not just moments. They are mirrors. And what people see in them, about celebrity, about accountability, about the strange and complicated relationship between public figures and the public that follows them, says as much about the audience watching as it does about the people on screen. That is the power of live television at its most unguarded. No edits, no second takes, just two people, a camera, and the truth finding its way to the surface whether anyone planned for it or not. If this story told you something you did not know before you clicked, if it gave you context that the clip alone could never provide, then you are exactly the kind of viewer Prime Talk was built for. Subscribe to Prime Talk right now. Hit the like button. Share this video with someone who thinks they already saw everything there was to see in that clip. And leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation is far from over, and the most interesting part of it might be what you have to say. We will see you in the next one.